become your masters of war. You that build all the guns, you that build the death planes, you that build all the bombs, you hide behind walls, you hide behind desks. I just want you to know that I see through your mask.
Welcome back, young scholars. In this video, we'll be discussing World War II. This is the second video covering World War II. The questions you should be able to answer after watching these videos are: first, what was fascism and what are its characteristics? Second, what were the causes of World War II? And then finally, this video will focus mostly on what were the major events in World War II that led to the Allied victory. We're going to pick up with the action in the Pacific Theater. You may recall that the Japanese had begun their imperial expansion in the 1930s by attacking Manchuria and then later China in the Rape of Nanjing. They then continued to expand as Europe was very occupied with Nazi expansion of their own. And so many of these European colonies, for example, French Indochina here, right, which included Vietnam and Laos and Thailand, or the Dutch East Indies, the French and the Dutch were simply unable to maintain control over these colonies. And so the Japanese are going to expand into China, into French Indochina, Thailand, capturing the Dutch East Indies. So Japan is expanding across the Pacific, forming an empire. They take control of conquered European nations' colonies like Thailand, French Indochina, and the Dutch East Indies. Who's going to be concerned about this? Who has a colonial presence in the Pacific that might be worried about Japanese expansion? Well, who controls the Philippines in the 1930s? That would be the United States. They also control the Hawaiian Islands out here, and they have naval fleets in both those locations. December 7th, 1941. The day that will live in infamy. The Japanese bomb Pearl Harbor, destroying naval bases in both Pearl Harbor on the Hawaiian Islands and also in the Philippines. So the Japanese see the United States as their only real significant threat to territorial expansion in the Pacific. And so they choose to go on the offensive first, by surprise attacking the United States. The United States really underestimated Japan's ability to be able to carry out an attack like this. But to be fair, the Japanese also underestimated the United States' ability to rebuild and move naval vessels around to reposition themselves to be able to more effectively fight the Japanese in the Pacific. So the United States, in response to the attack on Pearl Harbor, declares war on Japan. That means Germany now is going to declare war on the United States. And in 1941, the tide really begins to turn with the U.S. entering the war in favor of the Allies. So there are two major sides, and those are the Axis and the Allies. The Axis powers consisted of Nazi Germany, the Japanese, and the Italians. Those three made up an alliance that formed the Axis powers. We also have the Allies, which were composed of the United States, Great Britain, and the Soviet Union, kind of an unusual alliance between a democratic state, capitalist state like the United States, and the communist state of the Soviet Union. So we have our allies, our alliance between the British, the Soviets, and the United States. Now, once the United States was in the war, there were long discussions about, well, what exactly is the strategy going to be for the Allies? So Franklin Roosevelt got together with Winston Churchill, the British Prime Minister, to kind of hash out what the strategy might be. And they ultimately decide on a Europe first strategy. They choose to kind of put the war in the Pacific Theater on hold. The British are in very bad shape at this point as a result of the bombing of cities like London. And when we think about who's missing from the Allied team, right, that might be very concerned about these kind of decisions, that would be Joseph Stalin of the Soviet Union. And Stalin had very particular demands for the United States. He wanted the United States to open up a second front in northern France because the thinking was that that would alleviate some of the pressure that the Germans would have to split their troops and focus on fighting the Americans on the Western Front. And ultimately, the United States chooses to ignore what Stalin wants. And so if you're looking for the roots of what's going to come after World War II, and that's the Cold War, you might be able to point to some of these disagreements between the strategies of the United States and the Soviet Union. So the US instead chooses to begin its invasion in North Africa. So the US and British combined forces choose to attack North Africa, where Nazi Germany really had the sort of weakest presence. And they were able to successfully push back Axis forces into the islands of Sicily, back into Italy. And so Allied forces were able to defeat German forces in North Africa in a series of battles. Next, they're going to be headed to Italy. So capturing the island of Sicily, and then later moving into the southern part of Italy. Combined British and American forces invade Italy. The Italians eventually surrender. Benito Mussolini is killed. He's strung up and hung outside like a gas station. So Italy ultimately surrenders in 1943. At this point, the Soviets are able to achieve some pretty significant victories on the Eastern Front over here. German forces are defeated at the Battle of Stalingrad by the Soviets, and the Nazis are now in retreat. 1944, the United States and British, Canadians, and other Allied forces launch an amphibious invasion on the beaches of Normandy. They open up that second front that Stalin had always wanted. They're successful in establishing control over northern France, eventually recapturing the city of Paris. So Allied forces were able to successfully liberate France in 1944. At this point, the Nazis are, in essence, surrounded. You can see Allied forces causing the Nazis to essentially retreat back to the original boundaries of the nation of Germany. With Berlin surrounded, Adolf Hitler commits suicide along with his new wife, who I think they had been married for like something like 2 days. You know, just in case you need another reason to hate Hitler even more, Hitler, prior to committing suicide on his own, decides to kill his dog, Blondie. Now this means that the Allied forces have achieved victory in Europe. So hooray, that means the end of World War II. Except, remember about the Pacific theater. So next, the Allied forces have to decide on a strategy for defeating the Japanese. So there's a battle called Midway, and it really becomes the turning point in the Pacific. The United States is able to intercept some Japanese plans and are able to strategically attack the Japanese. The United States then sends its naval forces, and they begin recapturing islands across the Pacific. They eventually are able to retake the Philippines. They begin taking islands in Indonesia. They win some significant battles closer to Japan, like Iwo Jima and Okinawa. So the U.S. Allied strategy was to capture Japanese-held islands one at a time. This is known as island hopping. Sometimes they would surround the island in order to essentially starve the Japanese who were bunkered down on these islands. So in 1939, at the very beginning of the war, you had the German physicist who had migrated to the United States named Albert Einstein. And he writes to Franklin Delano Roosevelt, the U.S. president at the time, and tells him about some recent work that leads him to expect the element of uranium to be turned into a new important source of energy in the future. And he comments that this technology could also be used in the construction of extremely powerful bombs. As a result of this letter, the United States begins a project known as the Manhattan Project. It was incredibly secretive. The U.S. will eventually use the atomic bombs that it had developed as part of this Manhattan Project on the Japanese cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. large civilian casualties. Although these were both cities that were targeted because of their connection to the Japanese military, you still had obviously lots of civilian population that was impacted, that was killed by these large bombs. In terms of the major effects of World War II, first, World War II was the most destructive war in world history. 60 million deaths. It was a total war, and therefore many of the casualties were civilians, whether through the Holocaust or through the bombing of German cities by Allied forces like Dresden, or through the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Lots and lots of civilian casualties. And that is a significant difference between World War II and World War I. In terms of death counts by country, we see the Soviet Union experienced the largest number of casualties, then followed by China, Germany, Poland, Japan, France, and the United States. And so you can tell just how different the war was experienced by the United States and the Soviet Union. And again, this will be very important when we start to study the Cold War and we start to experience how disagreements over the way in which World War II had played out leads to these tensions between these two allied nations. Now, relations between imperialist nations and the colonies were ultimately strained. Many European countries again recruited in the colonies, and in return there was an expectation once again that these colonies would be able to achieve their independence following the war. Well, this time it starts to actually happen. You can notice a number of the dates of these countries achieving independence were in the period the 1950s, 1960s following World War II. And in the next unit, we will discuss at length this process of decolonization. We also see a rapid shift in the global balance of power. Prior to World War I and World War II, we talked about Europeans being in a position of dominance worldwide. Now we start to see the United States and the Soviets essentially assuming greater global power. And this will ultimately evolve into a conflict between the United States and the Soviets known as the Cold War, which we will also spend a significant amount of time on next unit. So the big questions you should be able to answer after watching these two videos on World War II are: first, what is fascism and what are its characteristics? Second, what were the causes of World War II? And third, what were the major events in World War II that led to the Allied victory? Thanks for watching.